I suppose we could get started. I don't think there's, and it's time. Let me thank everyone for coming to the session. My name is Mario Secarecci. I'm from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and I'm very happy to be here to chair the session and thank the organizers. There are actually 4 papers that are going to be presented in this session. 2 is a compounded sort of paper there, paper squared there. I mean, we're going to have 2 separate papers being presented by Milko Draka and Christian von Rosen. And then it would be followed by Ursula Costantini, and finally Tom Ferguson and Paul Jorgensen and Chi Chen together. What we shall do is follow that order, which is, I thought that was alphabetically, although admittedly, depending on how we start, who's the first author there. But we'll follow that route. So let's begin here. Let me just say a couple of words on the presenters. We have Milko Draka, who's assistant professor at the University of Warwick, and Christian von Rosen, who's the assistant professor at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And we'll start with their papers, and as I said, it's papers, there are 2 of them. The first one is on shadow lobbyists. That will follow, and we'll start with that.
Okay, so I'll take it away. All right, so thanks for coming to the presentation. So this is a paper called Shadow Lobbyists with a big team of researchers on it. Okay, so as a way of introduction, this work builds on some of our earlier work on revolving door lobbyists in 2012. So in that paper, what we did was we built a panel data set of lobbyists and lobbying revenues from publicly available data, and we estimated the value of political connections for ex-congressional staffers. Okay, so it's these ex-congressional staffers, people who move from working in the Congress to working in Washington's lobbying industry that we call revolving door lobbyists. Okay, and in that paper, we estimated the value of a political connection to these staffers to be worth about 20 to 25% of revenues, okay? And arguably this was a lower bound for the value of political connections in Washington's lobbying industry because in that case, we were only counting one type of connection, that is a connection to a congressman, a serving congressman, okay? So today we'll be showing extensions of this work or new projects based on the same kind of principle of mashing up various kinds of publicly available data set to look at political economy issues, in particular issues related to the incentives facing the political class, okay? And how, this has a bearing on, the type of policies they make and therefore inequality. Okay, so the basic motivation for this paper, Shadow Lobbyists, is about the effectiveness of transparency rules and regulations, okay? So particularly in the US, transparency rules have emerged as a prominent feature of modern political institutions. So there's enhanced disclosure requirements across a lot of areas. The value of this to us is simple. It allows us to observe the actions by political actors. That is, we can observe relationships between people, who is meeting who and who is paying who. Okay, and our approach is in particular based on one kind of transparency regulation, the Lobbying Disclosure Act from 1995, which has allowed a lot of data, a lot of rich data on lobbyist activities to be built up, and it has allowed us to kind of formally analyze this using statistical techniques. So this is a picture of the kind of basic information that you get in terms of the evolution of lobbying expenditure in Washington since records began in the late 1990s. So we see here in real terms this large increase in lobbying expenditures peaking in around 2008, 2009, and this tapering off since then, okay? So you can see that kind of tapering off. So, the lobbying boom of the, mid to late 2000s cooled off after Obama's first term as these major pieces of legislation associated with his first term, such as health and financial regulation, were dealt with. However, another recent feature of recent lobbying trends is the change in the participation of lobbyists. So at the same time that lobbying expenditures have cooled off, the headcount of lobbyists in the industry, of people active in the industry, has also been falling, okay, due to either people just kind of dropping out, becoming inactive, or indeed officially deregistering, that is, signing the form to say that they are no longer officially a lobbyist, okay? And this has occurred, this kind of change in the headcount of lobbyists has occurred at the same time as this relatively big increase in the regulation of the revolving door, okay? So through the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act and through the Obama administration's regulations related to the employment of people with recent lobbying experience. And that's where this paper I'm discussing now is going to fit in, okay? So this is what we see in terms of, this is what we've backed out of the data in terms of that kind of trend in the headcount of lobbyists. And what you can see here in the blue bars, okay, so we've got the grey bars as the entry of new lobbyists into the industry as counted in the data. Then the blue bars are the exit of lobbyists, the last time we see them. And you see this massive flip around of patterns in the industry. So we've got this growing industry up until about 2006, 2007, where entry exceeds exit. And then we have this big spike in exits, all right, after the introduction of these regulations around the revolving door. Okay, so the basic motivation of this paper, the idea of this paper is that since the career costs of being a lobbyist have increased, okay, so there's this enhanced regulation which may prevent your kind of future career options working in government, this has become an incentive for political professionals to potentially go underground and work as unregistered lobbyists, okay? This kind of thing is facilitated by a feature of the Lobbying Disclosure Act, okay, which is known as the 20% rule, whereby a political professional of some type doesn't necessarily have to register if they can make the claim that less than 20% of their time is devoted to lobbying activity, okay? And kind of unofficially, or in the colloquial, this has been sometimes known as the Daschle Rule exception. So after Tom Daschle, ex-Senator Tom Daschle, okay, who, since retiring from the Senate, worked as part of the firms Alston and Bird and DLA Paper, which have got major lobbying businesses, okay? And so that's just an indication of, it's kind of this well-known colloquial kind of idea that this is known as the Daschle Rule, that he's operating in these, well, people like Tom Daschle are employed in these big lobbying firms with big lobbying practices, but are not necessarily registered as lobbyists. So he's one case. Another famous case is Newt Gingrich, who worked as a historian for Freddie Mac. Okay, so who's, Freddie Mac were paying him large amounts of money, up to 1.8 million, for his historical expertise. So I'd like someone to employ me for my historical expertise in the same way. And he swung between an idea of historical expertise versus, and strategic advice, okay? And the obvious kind of issue here, this idea of shadow lobbyists, is that these people are perhaps, I'm not making that claim, any lawyers in the room, being employed for some of their lobbying firepower, okay? So what's the basic idea of this paper then? Given this setting about, this growth, well, this change in the headcount of lobbyists, this change in the direction of lobbying activity. So our idea is that while these ex-congressmen and ex-political staffers from the Congress are not registered, okay, may not be registered as lobbyists, their revenue earning power could still potentially turn up in the data, okay? That is, their presence at a firm, so these guys are leaving the Congress, going to work for these firms which have got some kind of lobbying practice, okay? And as part of that lobbying practice, that practice reports official revenues as part of the Lobbying Disclosure Act. The fact that these people have joined that firm may turn up in the data as revenue shocks, as increases in revenue, increases or decreases in revenue depending on their tenure at the firm. Okay, so hence our idea is to map information on the timing of these potential unregistered lobbyists joining and leaving these firms and tracing these revenue shocks in the data. Okay, so in that way we can kind of see the shadow they cast on the official data in terms of movements in revenue. And to do this, so essentially what we're doing is matching that official Lobbying Disclosure Act, those Disclosure Act reports of official lobbying revenue to this information that we've collected about ex-congressional staffers and ex-congressmen. So in the case of ex-congressional staffers, we use this comprehensive database from political information company Legistorm, which tracks both congressional staffers inside the Congress and outside the Congress in terms of their career histories and career biographies. And then we also do our own research on ex-congressmen and look up their histories and, focusing on whether they've joined these firms with reported lobbying practices. Okay, and so this is giving you an indication of, after this data collection, of the growth in this potential sector of shadow unregistered lobbyists. So this chart is showing you the stock of active ex-staffers in official lobbying firms. So we see this massive increase as these regulations kick in from about 2008 onwards. Okay, so I've got about a minute and a half. So you need less. Okay. So this is the growth. At the same time as I showed you earlier, the headcount of official lobbyists has fallen. We see this headcount of potential unregistered, unofficial lobbyists is rising at the same time, okay, potentially in response to these regulations. Then this is giving you a rundown of the ex-congressmen. So the previous slide relates to ex-staffers, revolving door lobbyists as ex-staffers. This relates to the ex-congressmen, okay, and there we see this big increase from about 2009 onwards as well. And then this is giving you, so we've spent a lot of time mapping this into the data, matching it up, looking at these firms in detail. So this is giving you an idea of where, which firms employ, the top firms employing these potential shadow unregistered lobbyists. Okay, so you've got Patton Boggs, a well-known, prominent lobbying firm, Brownstein, Hyatt and Farber, etc. Okay, and so we're estimating that this kind of unmeasured labour input in these firms probably totals up to about, 5% of labour inputs in these top firms employing these unregistered shadow lobbyists. Okay, so down to the final kind of result. Well, our first result in terms of testing this shadow lobbyist hypothesis. So the idea is to take revenues as our left-hand side variable. Okay, firm level revenues. So we built up this panel data set over about 12 years, 12 to 13 years. And then we're mapping in these measures of first the LU, let's go to the LO. So the LO is the official registered lobbyists. Okay, so it's just a count of how many official registered lobbyists there are at the firm. LU is this count of these unregistered potential lobbyists, these potential shadow lobbyists. And what we're going to be doing is, essentially the way this kind of stuff works is if you look at that alpha I term at the start, that's a firm level constant, a fixed effect. So essentially, once we include that, we're going to be identifying these coefficients, the beta and the gamma, off of changes in the count of lobbyists at the firm. Okay, so essentially we're looking at, just think of it as looking at what happens when, how does revenue change when these people join the firm, okay? So this is giving you the basic result. So I'll take you across these 4 columns, so, step by step. So in that first column, we've got that all shadow. So that's measuring the total count of shadow lobbyists, the change in shadow lobbyists at the firm level. So that number is telling you that, when there's a 1-person change in the count of shadow lobbyists at a firm, you see revenues kick up by 23%, all right? Then moving on to column 2, the major kind of modelling issue here is that this presence of shadow lobbyists at the firm could be correlated with other labour input decisions that the firm makes. Okay, so it could just be hiring a bunch of people in general due to labour demand shocks. So there, what we do is we put in the bottom row a variable to measure that in terms of all of the registered lobbyists that we can see in the official data. Okay, so that brings down that estimate by about half. Okay. So that's, picking up these labour demand shocks. Then the next 2 columns, you just break up what's going on here. So we've got, in that next column, we break up shadow ex-staffers and shadow ex-congressmen. And then the column after that, we break that up between shadow ex-staffers versus the official registered ex-staffers, these revolving door ex-staffers, and the official registered ex-congressmen. And so the final kind of interesting thing there is that what we see is that the revenue, the coefficients for the unregistered shadow staffers and unregistered shadow ex-congressmen are actually similar in magnitude to those of the official registered lobbyists, okay? So that leads me to my conclusions, okay? So we've got this, we can see in the data that the number of potential unregistered lobbyists appears to be growing, okay? And then what those results just showed you is that their presence at these firms appears to be correlated with changes in revenue, okay? And that these changes in revenue are of a similar magnitude to what we see for official registered lobbyists. Okay. Now, in terms of evaluating this, okay, so the Lobbying Disclosure Act does, has this 20% rule. Okay, so these people, they, legally and officially, they are allowed to provide input to the firm's kind of lobbying practices up to this 20% threshold. So therefore, this kind of gives us a test that we're going to evaluate in future work, is that, to what extent can we explain this effect, this shadow lobbyist effect, in terms of some kind of genuine productivity, people obeying the letter of the 20% rule, okay? And for that kind of assumption to be met, you've got to make some assumption about these guys being superstar lobbyists with higher productivity, okay? And that's what we'll be assessing in the next stage of the empirical work. I'll leave it at that because I've kind of gone a bit over time. I don't.
Thank you.
I'll do 7 minutes or something.
Okay,
Christian, I guess.
about 3 minutes over.
The second one, right? Okay.
Yep.
On the power behind the throne.
Yep.
So, Christian.
Okay. So thank you very much for coming. There's also joint work with Mirko and more people. So it's another build-up on our previous work. Oh. So the idea here is we found this result, as Mirko said, that these staffers that become lobbyists, they are important, they make a lot of money, their connections matter. So what we ask then is, why do they matter? How powerful are they actually running? Are they actually running the show? What can explain that they are paid so much? So what we do is the following exercise. We're going to focus on the most important staffers, which are the chiefs of staff, and we're going to see how they relate to changes in the campaign contributions of politicians. Let me tell you the big picture of this agenda. This agenda wants to see there are different types of staffers by importance, and there are a number of outcome measures that one can link to politicians, from ideology to campaign contributions to how active they are, etc., etc. Well, we want to see whether perhaps most of the effort and the tasks are actually done by the staffers while the politician is fundraising breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So who is actually running the show here? That's a bit the big picture question. We're going to start with this particular measure, campaign contributions. It's going to be extended to more measures in the future. And we're going to focus on these more important staffers for now, which are the chiefs of staff. Okay? I'm not going to spend time on the data because in the interest of time. Neither on this slide, because I want to do it 7 minutes so that the other speakers have time. It's just we're going to look at campaign contributions. And just one thing. So most of the effort in this paper is really on the econometric side, understanding which are the best ways to identify the same phenomena, like attacking the same problem from a number of dimensions and see whether from all these dimensions we find a similar result, to be sure that what we're finding really matters. In a nutshell, we have 5 different ways of saying it. Overall, what we find is chiefs of staff matter a lot in determining the amount of campaign contributions that a politician can raise. So we do find that they have a substantial role in influencing this. This happens when we compare things across politicians. So politicians that experience a change in the chief of staff have a much greater variance in where will the amount of campaign contributions go in the future. The ones that change the chief of staff, there can be big reductions in what they can raise, big increases. This does not happen for the politicians that do not change their chief of staff. Similar result happens. One can say, well, but perhaps the politicians that change chief of staff have many other different aspects than the ones that do not. So what the next exercise we do is take the same politician, track him or her over time, and see what happens when they change the chief of staff. So we're not comparing across, but rather within the individual over time. Again, we do find when there is a new chief of staff, a new show begins in terms of campaign contribution. And we predict that a new show begins in terms of how the speeches are written, where they position ideologically, with whom they work together, etc. This is for future work. Yeah? Let me show you this. These are the coefficients, but in a nutshell, it was what I told you. Let me show you this in a graph. This is just a simple graph that shows you politicians that stick to the same chief of staff throughout their career are much more likely to experience very small changes from year to year in the amount that they can raise in terms of campaign contributions. The greater variation in action happens when the chief of staff changes. Of course, we can do a lot of additional aspects, like see, do these changes in campaign contributions come from different donors? Do they just address a totally different set of industries? And that's where the staffer plays a role, because that staffer might have had previous access to that industry. Does it come from the same donors but in a different intensity? We don't know. We have to explore this. Yeah. Finally, let me decompose this into what we do as a fixed effects and a random effects exercise. What we are after is take all the information, all the variation that we can exploit regarding politicians' campaign contribution. And this, think of it, this can be explained by three things. By features specific to the politician, by features specific to the chief of staff, and by other elements that are neither related to the politician nor the chief of staff. Think of it as the three dimensions. The question we're after is, let us do a growth accounting exercise. How important is each of these parts? So when we do this, in a subset of all politicians, both the ones that change the chief of staff and not, we do find that politicians, if you only look at politicians and the rest is anything else that is unobserved, politicians explain around 40% of all the variation that we have in changes in campaign contributions. But if we rather put the light on the chief of staffers, this number increases to more than 40%, as if the chief of staff plays an even bigger role than the politician, him or herself, to raise funds. Yeah, that's the main thing. With a different econometric technique, we find more or less the same numbers, which is a panel analysis of variance. Bottom line, same number. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into details. Finally, let me show you just the histograms, how important they are. This is how important the politicians are in deciding their campaign contributions. You see there is a spike at 0, but there's like a normal, like a bell-shaped distribution. Most of it is at the right of the 0. If you do the same thing for the lobbyists, for the staffers, yeah, you also get a bell shape around 0. So these are reasonable things. This is just to show you that the results are not coming from some crazy distribution that we don't know where it comes from. These are very reasonable graphs. Finally, and I think more interesting is, we believe that there's a lot of potential in exploiting, as I said, other additional outcome variables, like policy counts, electoral margins, the wording in speeches. We're going into this whole text mining research agenda. We're going to get into that. Changes in ideology. We're looking into identification strategies. And one thing that we think is very nice is also politician networks. Yeah? So staffers do not change randomly across politicians. Of course, we guess that the staffers move from politicians that have some similarities, either ideologically or not. Then we wonder whether these changes in staffers lead to these politicians being close in their network or interacting more. But this is for future work, and I leave it here.
Okay, thank you, Christian. We'll go now to Ursula Costantini, who is a researcher at the University of Bergamo, and she will speak on, well, the title here is The Princess Rules, Economic Theory and Political Struggle in Europe. Okay.
Thank you. So I will give you a brief excursus of the history of what today is called the cyclically adjusted budget or structural budget from the 1930s onwards to get finally to the recent European events and then draw some conclusions about this. Can I have the thing for the slides? Thank you. So, okay. The 1930s was a decade in which the problem of the institutional form of the relationship between the state and the market emerged strongly. Traditional liberal views were challenged toward a progressive expansion of the economic weight and function of the state. With the end of the World War II, for much of the Western world, this coincided with the spread of the mass democracy of Hans Kelsen versus Carl Schmitt, of the countervailing power of capital and labor, of the state as a guarantee for full employment, and of the welfare state. As much as some of these post-war institutions are still formally in place, they have often evolved into empty shells or substituted even in essence by others, not always formally crystallized and well-defined. In a perfect transformista style, the cyclically adjusted budget has accompanied this evolution, happening to play a role in some crucial turning points in history. And in fact, if a most synthetic definition of this estimate can be the one that you find here above, and you can find in any textbooks, I will also show that these estimated rules, these estimated budget rules, are tools for gaining consensus, for supporting the effort of one power bloc to institutionalize a set of outcomes regarding the preferred form of the state-market relationship and of the fiscal framework. The cyclically adjusted budget moved its early steps in Sweden in the 30s, where Gunnar Myrdal had the idea of a rule that would force the government to balance the budget over the entire economic cycle rather than on a year-to-year basis. And this was just a budget mechanism. It was not an estimated constraint. This idea had a wide resonance at the time, and after the publication of the general theory, it was soon reinterpreted and incorporated into the fiscal program of the New Deal coalition in the US, especially by the Committee for Economic Development in the 40s. The Committee for Economic Development was a group of businessmen, expression of that block of internationally oriented banks and capital-intensive firms that emerged from the Great Depression and joined labor in an electoral pact to support Roosevelt. The committee was created in 1942, and fiscal policy was one of their main concerns. In two subsequent publications, 1944 and 1947, they proposed a detailed fiscal plan to return a small budget surplus at a level of income compatible with high employment, the high employment budget. In practice, this meant stability of stable and low tax rates and selected and limited spending programs. Especially, they thought that the best way to stimulate investments was to lower tax rates on corporate profits. And they thought, of course, that balancing the actual budget had deflationary effects. In the turbulent circumstances, political circumstances of the 40s, of the late 40s mainly, the Committee for Economic Development was, so to speak, trying to square the circle and to avoid acute class struggle on the one hand and acceptance of two socialistic policies on the other. And so to do so, incorporating some Keynesian concepts into a stable budget structure and budget yield target was a way to minimize legislative interference and to secure their vision of the state as responsible for maintaining high levels of growth compatible with high employment and price stability together. But as it appears clearly from their archival papers, and as it is proven by the following events in the 50s and the 60s, their insistence on automatic stabilizers was not a dogmatic belief. In fact, in the 50s, with the threat of class struggle diminishing as a result of repression, direct repression, and the growing business impatience with the attained growth rates of the decade, the Committee for Economic Development and other business groups as well embraced and supported financially the American Keynesian discourse for discretionary expansionary fiscal policy for growth acceleration. In 1961, Kennedy won the election with an electoral pact that went from human rights movement to big business, and appointed as economic advisors the most prominent Keynesian economists of the time, who transformed the high employment budget into a synthetic estimate, the full employment surplus. I guess okay. The full employment surplus showed the net fiscal effort of the government to influence the output trend and allowed to compare the discretionary non-built-in content of the different budget programs. It was based on an important concept of potential output due to Arthur Kuhn that showed the quantitative link between full employment and output in the short run. The potential output could be considered their short-term policy target, although the real Keynesian target was acceleration of the growth of potential output. While the full employment surplus was not a target nor a constraint for the Keynesians, mainly was a simplified instrument of comprehension and advertising. In fact, it did not require estimation of the multipliers. It didn't estimate the performance of fiscal policy, didn't account for different budget compositions. Yet it generally supported the idea that resources spent to achieve employment would be generally compensated by revenues with no destabilizing effects on prices. But while this reassurance was easy to maintain, I'm going very quickly here, when inflation was just an abstract concern in the 60s, it became harder toward the end of that same decade when inflation started to rise. And by then, however, the Keynesian consensus story about prices had much compromise, let's say, toward the quantity theory of money, and offered no real grip against the very much ad hoc policy suggestions and explanations of the monetarists, toward which even the Democratic Party started to bend. The shift, however, was not drastic, and especially regarding fiscal policy, and also especially regarding the full employment surplus calculations. Over the 70s, there were many discussions about this, about how to calculate most appropriately the full employment surplus as a target, because then it turned into a target once again. But the way it used to be calculated in the 60s wasn't really appropriate to use it as a target. And the discussion focused on the concept of potential output that became very controversial. Only in the 80s, however, this problem came to a solution that seemed satisfactory to many. That is, with the emergence of the statistical filters, detrending statistical filters that functioning like moving averages of actual output, avoided the problem of identifying an employment target that was politically controversial and problematic. That is also when the problem of employment exited the semantic even of fiscal policy, as terms such as structural budget emerged. However, only at a second remove, economists started identifying the resulting series, smooth series, as potential output. That is, when potential output came to be understood as a supply-determined, long-term concept, a variable that attracts output through movements of prices and expectations. And this reflected the partial incorporation through monetarism of an emerging doctrine, the new classical economics. To put it quickly and simply, everything that Keynesians took as policy targets were taken to be necessary characteristics of a well-organized economic system. And the lesson drawn for policy was that public institutions should concentrate on reducing uncertainty and enhancing transparency, deregulating markets, creating independent authorities, and so on. And this approach, in fact, rather than suppressing fiscal policy, it extended its scope, and that of economics as a discipline, to the regulation of the whole political process. And under this new doctrine, the cyclically adjusted budget became a different tool, one for budget trend surveillance, and furthermore for institutional reform. In fact, in parallel with the purely statistical methods, more flexible production function methods have developed. Both methods, however, are based on the idea that potential output is supply determined, and because the production function method itself relies heavily on statistical filters, both return series that closely track actual output. In fact, they have been defined ex post averages of actual output, meaning also they can be understood as ex post justification and validation of restrictive policies that affect actual output. But the production function method adds flexibility to this basic case, because it allows to adjust for the assumed effect of institutional aspects on potential output, for example, job market deregulation, job market reforms. And this is precisely why the so measured cyclically adjusted budget became a matter of an important matter of regulation in the European Union since 2002. That is when, as a result of conflicts between the European Commission and the European Council and individual member countries, all fiscal constraints were redefined in terms of structural budget. And this was part of the 2005 reform of the Growth and Stability Pact. And that came to include a series of clauses and country-specific aspects to consider beside the crude estimate, as well as a principle of conditionality on forecasting errors. So this softer, more flexible, and more sort of growth-friendly version of the Growth and Stability Pact, although growth-friendly is perhaps too much, was considered a personal success of German Prime Minister Gerhard Schröder. And it was actually only a partial success in the sense that he brought home the room for maneuver for Germany to go on with reforms and with the public investment programs. But he failed at undermining the power of the Commission completely, and he failed at abolishing the budget rule completely. For several reasons, smaller countries felt this as a guarantee against stronger, bigger countries such as Germany mainly. But also everybody, including members of the German government, such as Hans Eichel, the finance minister, felt the need to maintain a bureaucratic and supposedly technical validation of austerity, anti-labor, anti-welfare reform, whatever they wanted to implement in their own countries. They needed this kind of rule to comply with and to present as external and overimposed, as several memos from even the German government prove. So, in fact, it is telling that while the whole controversy in 2002 until 2005 against the Commission was rooted in showing the limits of the rule and the existence of these different possible interpretations of the estimate. Nonetheless, the solution came to be precisely to rely on those tools, estimated tools, even more. And this confirms that austerity was a national choice at the time rather than an imposition. And it reconfirmed also the deeply intergovernmental character of the Union and gave the impression that special circumstances would have always been worked out. And this would have perhaps been the case if other dynamics, economic dynamics, hadn't intervened and if crises had hit countries equally. But in 2010, the situation was much different. Several factors intervened. The absence of convergence policies caused precisely by this austerity framework, competition over labor cost, consolidation of structural asymmetries in a core-periphery equilibrium, and as a further element of disparity and fragility, the financialization of national public debt. So the 2011 Growth and Stability Pact reform and the following ones reflected this power distribution into the Union. And the so-called six-pack regulation looks like a stricter framework, and in fact it is for some countries. But it still contains the same clauses that the 2005 Growth and Stability Pact contained, but at the same time, it explicitly transformed the European fiscal framework into a wider system of economic governance that applies asymmetrically to member countries, depending on their financial fragility. The degree of interference with national plans is very high, especially for countries into rescue programs. Just an example, the two-pack regulation states that while that the countries in a rescue program are submitted to enhanced surveillance and post-program surveillance until they repay 75% of the assistance received. In this situation of asymmetric power within the European Union and of enhanced control of the European institutions, the flexibility of the rule that in 2005 appeared to provide more room for maneuver to single countries turned into an arbitrary mean of supranational imposition coated by scientific statistical precision. And so the scenario, and I'm concluding, I'm depicting, goes beyond ordoliberalism, beyond what some have called attack to a European social model, because what's happening is that the intergovernmental character of the European Union is fading away, and there is an attempt to redefine the locus of power and decision-making that reflects economic asymmetries and relations of financial dependencies. And as a side comment, yesterday Varoufakis said that it's difficult to reform the treaties. In fact, they've been reforming the treaties, and this is in a different way than the one he probably hopes for. What we are witnessing now is actually a process. It's a fact that firm leadership has so far failed to emerge. But what is clear is that democratic attempts to win this process only rely on national institutions. But when we get to the European level, the dissatisfaction with the fiscal framework and the recognition of the flaws of the estimates and of the economic concepts on which it relies does not lead to the rejection of how these cloaks political preferences, but rather to subtly push those preferences in a particular direction, and that is to use the cyclically adjusted budget once again as a tool to gain hegemony.
Thank you, Ursula, for your presentation. We have now the last speakers, I guess. The title of the paper is How Money Drives U.S. Congressional Elections, and it's authored by Thomas Ferguson, Paul Jorgensen, and Ji Chen. Now, I'm not sure the exact order, but I think there's more than one who will be speaking. Yeah.
Basically,
Well,
Paul and I will combine
right.
the first part, and G will chime in if she wishes. And that. Look, we'll try to cheer you up, okay, after those two papers, in the sense that our paper is almost funny, in the sense that what we're about to talk about is so obvious, but also so powerful and, in some fundamental sense, I think, so clearly diseased that you could hardly help laugh. Of course, in some larger picture, it's not funny at all. Let me just sort of, all I want to do is lay out our basic framework. You could actually do this in a series of pictures, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But just to sort of, for sort of sake of completeness, I need that thing at some point here. Our problem in this paper is, okay, what's the role of money in politics? And, most of us would say, I suspect in this room, if I had to guess, there is some self-selection here, I'm guessing. And it's probably fairly important. The view in most of political science, most of economics that even thinks about it, which not a lot, as all of you know, and for that matter, in most journalism, from the Financial Times on down, is that money can't be that important in politics. It's just way overstated. You cynics and things, people like that, are really just making mountains out of what are really molehills. We've got, some quotations in the beginning of the paper, but never mind. All right. Our take was this is probably nonsense. And the literature on this in political science, when you impressed us as pretty terrible, mostly what it would do is, first of all, it lacked any good measure of aggregate contributions, and it got bogged down in regressions on details. That is to say, it would say, well, if you're an incumbent, we'd study what money does for incumbents. If you're not an incumbent, a so-called open seat, we'll worry about that. Why doesn't it struck us that, why don't you do two things? Construct a real measure of total money in politics. We qualify that in a few minutes, but this is not that far off. In congressional elections, is our case today. construct that measure, and then why don't you just test the global hypothesis? I mean, forget all this crap about special kinds of races. Does money drive congressional outcomes or not? Okay, so our problem then was build the better mousetrap, which is a sort of American slogan. What the problem with the American money in politics story is basically we do the usual thing that Americans do, which is they drown you in data that is almost impossible to interpret, and it's just like you're sitting there looking for needles and they are pouring hay on you. And like in particular, if you give more than $200 total in a congressional race, you're supposed to have a little form filled out that tells some basic things like your name and address and things like that. What do you think people do? You get John S. Smith, John Smith, J.S. Smith. Then a lot of folks have more than one residence, so now you take all those and you give them several residential address variants, put a few hyphens in there for folks that might suddenly discover a deep attachment to their spouse they never otherwise do, or whatever, and soon you can see the problem here. And everybody's answer to this question in political science, after all the noise about let's be empirical, was nothing. Let's just basically, gee, that's too bad. Let's do some kind of first terrible approximation. So what we did is we went to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission databases, poured all the stuff, just said we're going to do this from the ground up. We don't believe anything anybody writes or the various public interest groups that try to process this data. I mean, we're not anti them. I actually found one of those years ago. But they're also, well, you get what you pay for, I fear, in some of these deals. But actually, the private, enormous profit operations, Merker and Christian, actually referred to one of those things. These folks make a lot of money, but they don't do much with the data other than lay it out. I have got a lot, because I've been working on this for 30 years or so. I often see some of this stuff because somebody's got a problem. It's just not very good. So we thought we could do better. We essentially started with some computer programs. Then we started tinkering with a private program that people sell for things like hospitals that really try to get the names right. Like if you get the names wrong, you've got somebody getting the wrong blood type or something like that. And so we have, nobody claims in a big data operation that you have everything fixed. It's sort of like, it's like St. John the Divine in New York. It's never really going to be finished. There's the cathedral there. But it is, we have definitely much better data than anybody else. And, you will quickly, you can sort of guess, right? Big surprise. It turns out that the concentration of contributions is just much higher than you would have guessed. And then what we've done in the last couple of years is to take the personal stuff, mix it with the corporate stuff, so that we've got the only real data on what you might call investing units, so that you can see for the first time at a glance how many different ways it's the same entity that is coming after you. That changes the look of the landscape again. Okay, now we would say, for all this, so this is really an interesting development in data. There's really a huge spectrum of political money. I got an essay where I wrote this out once, and we all admit that this doesn't catch all of political money. Just for example, consider that virtually every significant person on the White House staff came into that slot from one or more private groups that were paying them very large sums. In one hilarious case, an economic policymaker was being paid almost $1 million by a famous investment bank. What was his job? Advising them on philanthropy. Now, nobody pays. If you believe that the people get almost $1 million in a year for advising on philanthropy, you're in the wrong talk. All right, so we built this thing. And then we decided, all right, let's now actually take the simple solution here. None of this, what do various types of congressional races do? And so we then broke with the way people typically do it, which is dollars per something or other, or they assume models in which actually all the television contributions cost the same stuff. They just said, no, just take the cash, take the two major parties, take the percentage of the total that each major party has, run that against their votes. You know, this is as crude as it gets. This is the stuff they warned you about during the Cold War, that if you were an assistant professor, you could lose your job and things like that. We just said, hey, you know, Cold War's over, right? I mean, well, never mind. So we produced a very straightforward regression, this. And now here's how you'd read that. The way we do it is with the margin on the left, the vertical thing there, is the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans' vote totals in percentage terms, which means at the bottom you've got, and then on the right we are running out the percentage of two-party money. So probably the simplest way into this is to do the exact opposite of what I just started to do with you. Go to where the Democrats get all the money and all the votes in that upper right-hand corner, and then where they have no money and no votes in the lower left-hand corner. And then everything comes out. Well, when we presented this for the first, it was kind of interesting. Economists snickered and sort of began to, and a lot of political scientists just got angry, like this is just impossible, et cetera. But then the objection came back, and it's really the only one one can sort of do, well, maybe they're just giving it to popular people. And so that sat there, along with the question, which we also asked ourselves, what does this look like in other congressional races? We did 2012 first. We actually did check in a paper we published in 2013. 1980, which is the earliest point for which there's data, that looks just like that. And then 1996 looked just like that. Maybe a remark on the spatial regression, though hardly anybody that does Congress studies does this. It is a fact that congressional districts are next to each other in space. They're nearer in some and further than others. The bottom line on this is that's called spatial autocorrelation, and it has effects on the accuracy of the estimates like temporal autocorrelation, which a lot of people have no trouble with. So our problem was thus twofold. What do the rest of the other elections look like, which Paul will tell you about in a minute, and then what can you do to get out of that famous problem, the chicken and egg problem? Are you giving the money to popular people, and so you're really overestimating the importance of money in the regression, or not? And our answer, people have known about the answer to that question for a long time. In theory, you want an instrumental variable. But instrumental variables are a bit like the grin of the Cheshire Cat. When you look at, in Alice in Wonderland, when you look at them closely, the grin starts to fade away. And when you study this literature, you find not one, but like 40 different estimates of the instrumental variables. And what's more, when you start really doing the econometrics, you discover, how do you know you've got a really good instrumental variable? Because you can't think of any reason why it's wrong. Now, if there's anything you know about American social science, or for that matter elsewhere, the European case may actually be more, maybe worse there, you can be sure that they're not going to be very imaginative about finding things to explore political money. So, like, we don't really want an intuitive criterion. Our answer was to go to some newly developed instrumental variable models which are latent. That is to say, you don't know what the variable is. Our problem, however, was that while one could find papers with this, we needed a spatial version of that. And so we went to G and just said, can you solve this? And you know, I confess, since I've worked with her for a long time, I will occasionally toss her a question, can you solve this or do this, just to see what you can find out, because it always comes back solved. And in this case, she came back after 2 weeks and just said, I think this will actually work. And yes, it does work. So you get, therefore, a latent, spatial latent variable regression. Now, since this is a Bayesian story, you can estimate what you hope is, therefore, the true value of the coefficient. You don't know what the other values are. And I will now just turn it over to Paul, who
Okay, so then what are you looking at here? We did every single House race where a Republican and a Democrat ran against each other. Now, in the United States, Louisiana is always an outlier. We have multiple Republicans, multiple Democrats, so we remove those cases, but you're still left with an N size of at least 430 to 435 in most years. And you can see that they're all linear. And in these plots here, we're presenting the best model possible, which I'll show you the table in a minute. So what are the data points? The data points are all money that we can find. So number one, that'd be candidate expenditures, money coming out of the candidate's own campaign. Second, all independent expenditures. Third, all coordinated money. And then after 2002, there's a weird category in U.S. politics called electioneering communications. There, we are the first that I know of to try to identify that money for and against a candidate. Now, a couple trends. One, starting in 2006, roughly, candidate expenditures are less percent of the total than before. So from 1980 to 2006, roughly 90 to 100% of all money in a congressional race comes out of the candidate's campaign. Therefore, political science uses candidate expenditures as a proxy for all money. After 2006, that's a bad move because more and more money is being spent on independent expenditures or theoretically money outside of the candidate. And then that explodes obviously after Citizens United in 2010. So from 2006 to 2014, roughly, you're seeing candidate expenditures as a percent of the total drop below about 80%. Roughly, it's been 75 and 80%, and the trend line is downward there. So you have to catch more and more outside money. But you see, money works the same way even in 1994, right? That bottom one there. That's a very, very important election. Senate, same story. I'll come back to 94. Now the dots and the data points aren't quite as populated, but you still see a linear relationship in the Senate. So 1994, why is that an important case? Because the expectation was the Democrats were going to win. It was the first time in 40 years Republicans took back the House in the U.S. Now, this is important because, as Tom mentioned, does money actually buy the votes or does it go to the expected winner? Well, in 1994, it's a great test case because the expected winners were the Democratic Party up until Election Day. So what this chart is showing you is an Iowa prediction market where people gamble on who's going to win. It was 80-20 Democrats all throughout October, so most of the money was on the Democratic Party going into the 94 race. And then what changed? Well, Republicans' explosion of money. In October of 94, the Republicans congressional candidates plus the party committees outraised the Democrats by over $15 million in that month, and that continued over to November, in that first week of November. Previous, as you can tell by the chart, the Democrats are outpacing Republicans. In September, both raised almost to the penny the same amount of money, around $21 million, and then things dramatically shifted, and that was a pretty impressive bet on the Republican Party. Here are the tables. So this is the second way that we can show that the so-called endogeneity problem doesn't quite hold water here in money and votes. And again, like Tom mentioned, there's no good instrumental variable for money. Money is that universal equivalent that we're all aware of. So what we did is spatial regressions plus a latent instrumental variable model. And the important column there is that second to last one with the R squared or the pseudo R squared. And again, highly linear models for the House. The slopes change slightly from election to election, and we're still working on interpretations for that, but there's still pretty strong coefficients. And even for the Senate, In 1998, the Senate is obscene how linear that is at 0.9 r squared. So to wrap it up, in some cases, your average regression will work, but in most cases, especially for the House, you have to have a spatial model, and this is obvious because districts overlap with the same media market, so the money spent on a Democrat in one district may bleed over to the next. And then we end our paper with just a little jab at some of the apologists out there on money, and there's this thinking out in the scholarly literature that somehow big business and corporations in particular are middle of the road ideologically. They get to both parties, and they're not causing polarization. Well, we are starting to nitpick at this argument a bit, and one way to do it is to exploit our investing unit IDs and investing units, so our complete aggregations of money into a firm. And it's not, what we found is with regard to the Tea Party, both in our presentation a few years ago at this conference and then now today, it's not just an isolated few billionaires that's driving polarization. These are corporations, and an overwhelming majority of big business did give to the Tea Party in various amounts, and that's what we're showing here. It's a mixture of the Forbes 400 and Fortune 500 companies, and so.
Thank you very much. Now we have a discussant here, Professor Alain Parguez, who's a professor emeritus from the University of Besançon in France.
Yes. First, I would play my Paul Martin guys. This is the best session I ever attended in my life. And I do think there should be a Nobel Prize in political science, and indeed Tom Ferguson should receive the first true Nobel Prize. No. I dared, while being not asked to write a short paper, I would not talk of him on, it is on the site, the death, the perversion of democracy and the cause of inequality. I am more and more thinking that there are no objective economic laws. It's a joke. But there are political class conflict laws. First, I am very impressed by the fact that hearing all of you, I am more than ever impressed by the difference between the situation in the United States, where there is still some democratic spirit, and the Eurozone country where democracy is dead forever. Because all your outcomes relied on a core fact and assumption. There are two parties in the United States, and there is still some separation of power between the president and the Congress. While in Europe, be it in France or England, we do have a totalitarian system. There is only one party sharing exactly the same political ideology, completely indifferent to the fate of the people. So, and why? Because of the absolute power of, in France, the president, in England, the prime minister. The parliament is deprived of any role. I think we are back to the times of Walpole at the time of George II. So, why spend money when the Parti Socialiste in France, the Blairite Party in England are possibly on the right, on the Orthodox Conservative Party? The budget are voted by decree. Ursula wrote a wonderful paper. She would also later deserve a Nobel Prize. I do think that even the most conservative and Tea Party people in the United States would never have accepted the totalitarian, absurd system which is the Euro system. I spent a month trying to understand the French budget and the German budget. There are very interesting points. First, what only matters is to get the support of the financial markets. Second, the structural budget. Of course, the super technocrats to whom de facto political power has been delegated. They say, what is the structural budget? It does not matter. We don't know, but it is a useful concept to crush the people. So, I must confess, I don't have any critique to all of you, really. All of you made one of the most wonderful jobs I ever heard. I am more and more shocked by my economic colleagues, excepting, of course, some of them. What matters is true political science. More Tom Ferguson and more all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain Parguez. Now we'll have a bit of time left for questions from the audience. Yes?
Yeah, I would have a question for Professor Ferguson and his group. Really wonderful, very, very interesting work. The question I would have is how the money is being spent. I guess TV ads and things like that. And let me ask you, tell you why I'm asking this question. I come from Italy. Have done some work on what we call voto di scambio. So you pay to get one vote. You pay a poor person to get one vote. And what I've noticed in some southern Italian towns is that whereas you have deflation in all other prices, goods like shoes, etc., during the crisis, in some instances, the price of one vote actually increased. And I guess it increased because, of course, you pay for a vote because you want to get to power and you want to use public money to your interest in some way or other. And since the budget is shrinking, the competition to get to that budget is increasing, so people are prepared to pay more to get one vote. So, and I've seen something like that in Greece. And if you look at Golden Dawn in Greece, the amount of money they are paying to get support, food distribution, healthcare support in neighborhoods in Athens. They do this, and it's very expensive. So that begets the question how the money is being spent and what is the effective way to get political support by spending money, especially in a situation where middle classes don't see their income raise, high unemployment, etc. I think it's not the same area you're working on, but it's really the question I would have now, how the money is being spent. There is a clear correlation. The more you spend, the more the highest likelihood you have to get to be elected, but then it's the productivity of money and how people who get to vote, what they are requesting from you.
Maybe I could collect at least 2 or 3 questions. Are there any others? If not, we'll just go ahead with that. Yeah, okay.
My question, also for Tom and Paul, has to do with the differentiation across sectors of the market. Are the more regulated sectors of business more likely to be substantial givers, and have you looked at that differentiation?
No more? Okay, then go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm sure Paul will want to talk. She may want to add something. Very simply, the type of what it's called in American politics, walking around money for the campaign workers on election day, that used to play a huge role in American elections. I mean, it's insane, but it's true. One of my colleagues, when I was a grad student at Princeton, he walked in the polling place on election day and discovered the post of Republican leader in the district had no one running. So he wrote himself in. And so by 1 vote to nothing, he became the Republican leader in Princeton, New Jersey, and party his little ward or wherever. And he knew lots. I know, I'm not saying he had any part in it, that on election day there'd be guys distributing bales of hay in a lot of the smaller New Jersey towns. When you opened up the bales, there was cash in there, and it was for the party workers. And New Jersey I should explain too, it's pathological and has been for many years. If you're looking for that kind of stuff happens. Where Paul teaches was for 100 years, at least, one of the most famous areas of this, and he teaches along the Rio Grande, University of Texas, Rio Grande. He can maybe say a word about that in a minute. But that's not any longer representative. That's not the basic story. Most of this cash, you have to understand too, a lot of it will go for television stuff, but let's not get carried away here. Don't make the mistake of thinking people use money to turn up voters. They also spend money to make sure they don't vote. There are a lot of ways you can do that, ranging from funny attacks to demoralize people, to you will even get strange things like somebody will pop up and say, well, it really doesn't matter who's voting anyway. You will get all kinds of, and then much nastier stuff at the polls, of which a lot has been written about. Cash is used to win elections, not to maximize votes. Okay, if you know, and you can see this, in particularly grotesque in the American case, where the turnout differentials are enormous, have been for most ever since 1900, with a break in the New Deal. Walter Dean Burnham and I have written about that. Almost nobody else pays attention. In Europe, the turnouts have generally, on average, been falling over the last 35 or 40 years. I think Fritz Scharpf and some other folks have done stuff on that. But that's my comment. You may want to say something.
Yeah, so I live 10 miles north of the Texas-Mexico border, and so you do see this. And the money is used to turn out certain people, but it's the same turnout machine almost every time. And so you still have turnout of maybe 10%, and it goes actually up depending on if it's a county commissioner or a school board. And actually turnout for Congress and the president is actually quite low. And so you get this inverted model there. And it happens in Mexico quite a bit more. But yeah, again, how the money is spent, it goes to this neoclassical idea of, production function or something like that. And, there's some evidence that knocking on doors and shaking hands works more than ads, sort of that personal touch. But that is not done for everybody. By no stretch of the imagination. So Burnham's a good person to cite here because he said very early on that the rise of money after Citizens United and the decline in turnout, and he said, welcome to 1895, everybody, which goes to your point you made earlier. So, yeah, how the money is spent, you see some of that actual exchange. It's not just cash, it's drugs and cigarettes and things like that. But that's an old party machine that doesn't quite exist anymore. In terms of more regulation, more giving, Tom can speak that a lot more. But yes, you see massive amounts of money from pharma, from oil. And these folks are trying to shut down conversations with that money.
One comment on that, though. Anybody who feels threatened, whether they're regulated or not, will probably, you can actually see this in the data. If financial stuff comes on the thing, you can say they're already regulated, yes, but there's a very clear threat, challenge, response, sort of story to a lot of this. And it's a huge error to think that if you somehow deregulate an industry, that this stuff would disappear. And indeed, in the whole 19th century, where regulation was barely in existence, you're as close to the night watchman state in much of the United States as you ever could be, people were raising enormous sums of cash, though more locally than at the national level.
Are there any other questions that people would like? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, maybe to Mr. Ferguson, just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, I think we can all agree that definitely money in politics plays a very has a corrosive effect on democracy. And we can see that legislators in the U.S., for example, are actually not really representing the interests of the public in general. And in fact, I actually read that the U.S. is going through the way of turning into some sort of oligarchic state, representing interests of big business. So I just want to get your thoughts, maybe what possible solutions are out there to getting rid of money in politics, and maybe also the relationship between this and the impact on inequality. Yeah.
Okay, I think this question is very, very simple. The classical model of democracy where you just sort of assume that the costs for the population making up their mind and voting and actually sort of controlling the state are really small, so that you could just sort of assume, like, in effect, you could treat the Lockean democratic story as it's basically a low-cost deliberation, low-cost control. You just do it. That stuff's all crap. It's actually fairly expensive. And so you have two choices. Either everybody pays a little, or a few folks will pick up the bill for the whole thing, in which case they control it. I think it's real stark. You got to accept the fact that there are real costs. This is basically the investment approach to political competition I sort of put up for a long time. Now, let's see, your other question was on? Inequality. Oh yeah, on inequality. First thing you got to grasp is that, yeah, all this money sloshing around is plainly, and it's an obvious reflection of inequality, right? I mean, the reason you can do this sort of thing is because you've got a lot of money to begin with. But, it's the same time, it's a huge error to think, and I'm going to go back to that notion of the spectrum of political money. There's a lot of other money floating around in the system, though it doesn't show up in elections. Just if you start looking at these, you come to a really striking case, which is sort of terrifying. It's in it's a graph in an essay that Rob Johnson and I did on the financial crisis, where it's you graph out regulator salaries over time. Let's see, I got to go the way you would be doing this, which would be this way, right? So those creep along like a tortoise, year after year. And then if you graph cash made by, say, whatever you can get data for, we use Piketty and Saez, I think the 1/2 of 1%, and that just goes up like that, while the regulator salaries are going like that. Well, just think about that one for a while. This has nothing to do with campaign cash at all. But it's basically telling the regulators, you can walk out of here to a much better job. And they do. It basically turns the regulatory agencies, and indeed, if you want to take almost the entire government, ranging from ex-presidents, right? I mean, the number of scandals in almost every country now, from Tony Blair on, you name it, the Clintons, all the Republicans, is enormous. And what you're seeing there is that inequality itself is so pathological. There's a point, I think, where the political process becomes completely pathological, and even in the unlikely effect that they were all obeying the rules. It's a scary show. At a certain point, you may just not matter. You can tinker with this stuff, but inequality by itself will just restructure society one way or the other. It will happen.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yes, a question to Professor Ferguson. Apparently, and interestingly, from your data, we can see evidence of political cycles in the US. But I was thinking, for the question that you have done before, that maybe it could be for decomposition of the expenditure, because maybe, for example, given that now we have Obama, but we have seen an increase in the expenditure of Republicans, this could be due to the fact that many money have been spent to prevent people from voting.
problem with the American election system is the voting turnouts typically are very low to begin with. Now, neither party really sees itself as having a huge interest typically in trying to turn out a lot of people. What you see toward the end of campaigns is get out the vote drives, which is different, which means the subtext is of registered voters who are, and not much of an effort to run registration drives. The passivity of the Justice Department under Obama, I was writing stuff about this. They sat there for like 2 or 3 years before the 2012 election, and you could see the states doing things, the Republican-dominated state legislatures doing all kinds of things to make it hard to vote. They didn't do anything till like a year before. It was actually, it's sort of ridiculous. The turnout problem is too big for this type of a discussion. Walter Dean Burnham has a great essay called, Toward the Politics of Plutocracy or something. It's just available free at the Roosevelt Institute website. There, you probably just want to take a look at that. The question's complicated, but there's no sort of single variable turn down most elections in the U.S. if it's close, they can be affected by direct efforts to turn down turnout, but they mostly get won or lost on somewhat bigger margins. That's the sort of short answer.
If there are no other questions, okay, sorry, yes? Go ahead.
Okay, I want to involve the other speakers. I start with Ursula. You're basically highlighting the technocratization of macro policy, let's say. You have these rules which confirm reality because they are tautological, let's say. My question is, you have a new government in Italy, and leftists, supposedly, and what is the government doing? Are they really doing something different, or are they accepting the same kinds of rules? And then I want to move to the lobbyists. Maybe I missed this, but you very clearly presented the importance of the revolving door and so on. Is there any difference between Republican Party, Democratic Party in what is happening? Maybe you said it, but is there a clear difference? And then a final question for the three of you, and actually for everybody, that is, if you think of political processes and political competition or political choice, I don't like competition. I think it's more like choosing. But then to me it seems like choosing from one taste. Like, what does it matter? It's the same thing. Like if the new Italian government is doing what the old Italian government was doing, what is the difference? From a European perspective, maybe I'm idiosyncratic in that. What is the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in terms of outcomes, policies, ideology, or whatever? So, I see that there are these swings and so on, but looking at it from, let's say, a democratic point of view, you would like to have something to choose, and what is there to choose? That would be the final question.
Okay, thank you. There was also someone else who wanted to, someone else there.
I would like to ask about the role of foundations and trusts in the US and in the UK. Because my friends that work at environmental NGOs, for instance, they receive funds from the Ford Foundation occasionally. So what would the role of them be in the entire game?
I'm quite scared of this machine. It's a bit. In terms of you trying to lobby, and you're a star in the system. It's a certain way of behaving in terms of style or background. Is it from law or from someone? in the European, I mean, like, no, I mean, like, in the EU, if you're trying to lobby Brussels, I mean, like, for example, the Danes are quite different from the Swedes. The Italians are good at having a long lunch, you know, I mean, and so on and so on and so on. And I wonder, in your story, if the stars are of a certain type. Yeah.
Okay, actually, I'm going to ask one last question as well and add it to the pile. This is for Tom et al., which is that, you know, where I come from, they cap what are the contributions up to $1,000 for individual contributions. And we also have party financing, which is like $1 per vote, depending on the party that you voted for. Now, would that perhaps deal in part, or to what extent? Like, what's your opinion about that?
Okay, so in terms of the two questions we got, so Republicans versus Democrats. So in earlier work, we tended to find that Republican lobbyists earn a bit more. That's probably just because of the way there's just a bigger market for their services from corporate donors. In this current work on shadow lobbyists, we haven't yet looked at differences between Democrats and Republicans, but we were talking about this earlier. So one possibility is that the Obama administration regulations and the employment of recent lobbyists would bite harder for kind of Democrat-affiliated lobbyists, right? Because they see a much higher probability that they could get a job in the administration. So that's something we'll look into. In terms of how people lobby, so as you know, as I said at the end of the presentation, you know, we see this revenue effect of these shadow lobbyists. It could be explained by superstar effect. We don't really know anything about how these people lobby particular, you know, I assume they leverage contacts. They leverage some kind of contacts that they have in some all-American style. I guess what we're going to look at in the data is, we're going to try and explain it in terms of observables. Okay, so we're going to try and explain the size of these revenue effects in terms of the experience of the ex-staffers or the experience of the ex-congressmen or the type of committees they were on, and that's the best we can do. Okay, I think that's all I had.
Okay, thank you for your question. First of all, I'm not like totally comfortable with the word technocratization, because yes, I mean it is true that we could say that in a sense, but the technicians have a validation role, but the content is not technical, you know, and somehow by saying simply technocratization, we tend to forget that. And also we tend to forget that the technicians themselves often admit completely the flaws of the estimate. And you know, all estimates have flaws after all, but you know, it depends on why and how we use them. Those flaws can be acceptable or not, obviously. And how we use those estimates is a political problem. On top of that, there are not only there isn't only this tautological problem. There are also other problems that in my paper I highlight more deeply, but concern, for example, the elasticities that are used in the formula. That I mean, the formula is very sensitive to those elasticities. Those elasticities rely on very few data, rarely updated, so it's really very problematic aspect. Plus, there are these structural factors that affect potential output. For example, if we talk about Italy, the recent job reform, the Jobs Act that was implemented in 2 tranches in 2014, had immediately an effect on potential output, because that as an assumption, just an assumption, because there's nothing in an actual formula that can support that, potential output would rise thanks to this more enhanced flexibility of the job market, and that creates more room because for fiscal action, because it enlarges the output gap, supposedly. So in a sense, the only way, because of how it's constructed, this potential output, the only way or the best way for governments to gain room for fiscal action is to implement structural reforms in the sense of deregulations. So it's really, a way to channel what governments can do in order to gain some room that is not all a solution, because it's not enough room. It's not really an expansion. It's something to keep up with the expenditures. And but Italy, as I think the political position in Europe of Italy hasn't changed, in the sense that since even 2005, I mean, even before, because the position in Italy, in Europe, is rather that of looking for special treatment, because we are a larger country, but and so it is more problematic for other larger countries to let just Italy go or treat them just like Greece or Spain. But at the same time, they don't want to associate themselves with the periphery, so they play this double-faced game, in the sense that they, in the tables, in the technical tables, they do not support when a Spanish delegate says something against the rule, but then they try to argue in their budget law that actually the potential output estimate is underestimated, and so they try to do their own bargaining game, and without really trying to build a response, because either they think it's impossible, or either they think either they don't want it. They want to be among those that take advantage of this core periphery situation in Europe, rather than doing something else. And it is a center. It's not a left government. They are the government with the support of the right of a right-wing party as well. So we could say it's sort of a center government, center right, center left government, a unified party, as Professor Pagues just said. And it is very much an example of how even national democracies are struggling, because most of these new rules are being adopted by decree, as Professor Pagues was just saying. So, yeah.
On the roles of foundations and think tanks, well, one, they're going to bankroll ideas and their policy shops in the U.S. We have something called the American Legislative Exchange Council that replicates bills and model bills across the different states. But I think a more important point for campaign finance is that it's becoming quite common to organize as nonprofits. And this is the U.S. style of money laundering in elections. So the nonprofits, actually for good historical reasons, don't disclose their individual donors. So if you look at a super PAC, we'll call it Crossroads, and Crossroads will have a large donor, and that donor will be Crossroads nonprofit. So then who actually gave the original money, you're not going to know unless you do some more digging. So the government doesn't keep track of that. And the current presidential crop now has already set that machine up. And so the Jeb Bush machine, the Right to Rise, he has leadership PAC, super PAC, and nonprofit that are all going to give to each other to clean the source of the money. And so I would pay close attention to that. In terms of capping the money, we've tried that in the U.S. to a certain degree, and you're just changing the nature of the market a bit. But the money it's always going to be relative, and then so I think public financing would be the only way to go.
Okay. I want to caution against one thing, or could be said to be just methodological advice. It's a huge error to think that even when you face a bunch of basically center-right parties, or as the Frankfurter Allgemeine put it just about 3 weeks ago, and actually said it this bluntly in an article on Spain, that the system of austerity in Europe depends on the alteration of two major parties. And were that to disappear, so would the austerity regime. In other words, you got to go from Tweedledee to Tweedledum, to use the old Alice in Wonderland phrase, there. But it's a big mistake to think that Tweedledee and Tweedledum typically don't differ in some fairly important ways. It varies across countries. It is impossible to give sort of generalizations here. It can disgust anybody whose focus is on, like, the population's general welfare. But there's still a lot of difference. You can see this in a couple of ways. One of them is, well, just take a look at Obama. The most critical decision he made, probably, well, let's set bank rescues off to one side, was to do a half-size fiscal stimulus. Now, that was half-sized. What was the Republican offer? Zero. And for sure, I think the U.S. is better off. It's not great. I'm not trying to tell you that the U.S. is paradise. But if they had done no fiscal stimulus at all, we would probably be in the condition of the United Kingdom. That was a party difference. That type of difference runs fairly far back, though some people rather exaggerate it. Larry Bartels is right when he says that macro policies are different, but then Bartels helps his case out by never mentioning Paul Volcker and other, which all occurred under Democratic administrators. But there are those differences. You can also see it in our data a touch, not a lot, but some. First of all, most union money goes to the Democrats. Unions are way outspent, but never mind. The other side of it is the role small donors play in the parties does differ systematically. We walk through this for 2012, and we sort of show you that less than $200 donors, you can't tag them individually, but you can sum them up. And the Democrats were pulling, my memory is about 20% of their total cash from small donors. Republicans were getting almost nothing. This does not say, this has nothing to do with, are both parties dependent literally on the 1%? We walk you through examples of this in our piece on 2012 that's actually in Mario's journal, the International Journal of Political Economy. And the answer is they are. They're both dependent on 1% contributions. Nevertheless, the type of coalition they're doing is somewhat different, and it has different and traceable policy effects. It is not going to be night and day, and you can easily understand, and it's indeed the problem the Democrats face now, especially after the 2014 elections, for a large chunk of the traditional Democratic constituencies, which were blue-collar, they probably can't see a perceptible difference. That doesn't, however, mean that they weren't affected by the decision in particular to go to a half-size fiscal stimulus instead of nothing. This is a very simple calculation. You can do it and sort of work it out. So it's, I think, pretty vital if you're trying to understand politics to keep track of the world looks one way if you're an ordinary person and another if you're not. And you often must understand, in effect, the way elites perceive things. It's not the same thing, and they see differences. It's the familiar Eskimo and snow problem. Talk to an Eskimo and they talk about 17 different kinds of snow. To me, especially this year in the city of Boston where we had 8 feet in about a month and a half, it's all snow.
Let me thank all the speakers here for having engaged in what was a true exercise in political economy here, in a sense. And I'm very happy. And I also wish to thank all the participants here for contributing to this wonderful session. Thank you very much.